specializing in exercise physiology, right, nutrition, and particular aging, right, and is director in effect of Aging Muscle and Bone Health Laboratory. And he will talk about the creatine supplementation in older adults, particularly focused on muscle, bone, and brain. So.
Okay, thank you very much. I think everybody can hear me. A couple things. I do have the chair up here. We'll do a little bit of interactive things that'll highlight the biological effects of aging. Thank you all to the sponsors and the organizing committee. It's been exceptional so far. I have a very tough act to follow, so let's get right to it. Again, my university's in Canada, so we had a long jet last night and a little bit of jet lag today, so we're going to talk about some of the effects as we get older with creatine. There's my disclosures there, as highlighted by Rick as well. I'm a member on ALSCAM advisory board and other companies that make creatine. The lucky thing for me, going in the afternoon, I don't really need to talk about creatine. We had a really exceptional array of speakers this morning. But for those who watch Saturday Night Live, it's a big show worldwide. Christopher Walken used to say, I have a fever, and it used to be more protein. And then I've evolved this now, instead of cowbell to protein to now creatine, which we've obviously talked about a little bit before. So I'm going to break this talk up into three areas: muscle and lean mass, and then we get into bone, and I just touch briefly on the brain. There's other exceptional brain researchers. Obviously, Sergey talked about this morning, and Theo did as well, how we're really evolving from the neck up. And Ali's in the audience there. His seminal paper has been cited thousands of times as well. So as you can see here on the left-hand side, this is what we're all trying to achieve. You can see here the femur is very, very strong. The yellow subcutaneous the yellow tissue is skeletal muscle, and the red is subcutaneous fat. So as I mentioned earlier, for me to break your femur, I would really have to hit the table quite hard. But as you get older, I could probably crack your femur if I had to. Is that a good thing? Hopefully everybody would agree not. And then we're going to talk about falls, fractures, and the importance of strength shortly when I use the chair analogy. Unfortunately, for those who are sedentary, this is kind of what happens as you move forward on the right-hand side. Bone mineral density decreases, muscle tissue decreases, and subcutaneous fat goes up. So I think from a lifelong perspective of physical activity, that is crucial for longevity. We just recently sort of updated the meta-analysis looking at all the effects of creatine on lean tissue mass. And we'll do a caveat here when we get to lean tissue and muscle strength. This was sort of an elaboration on the number of subjects. We had over 600 individuals, 50 years in age, and they had to take resistance training for about 5 weeks or more. And the good news is that since we're at a creatine conference, without being biased, creatine and resistance training or brisk walking in combination was shown to still increase lean body mass by about 1.18 kilograms, or about 3 pounds on average. So you're thinking, is that even meaningful? Is there any potential issues with this? The big factor is this was lean body mass. The question you should be asking, is it muscle? Do you know no studies ever measured muscle when it comes to creatine supplementation? Think about that for a second, and we'll come back to why that is. Last year was at a sarcopenic conference. It's going on exactly right now in Toulouse, France. And I said, no way, I'm going to Germany. I don't need to go to the sarcopenic conference anymore because 4 days, get this, we speak about creatine, which is good for 4 days. 4 days at a sarcopenic conference, the whole time they trashed the use of DEXA. They said it only measures lean mass, no one cares. It encompasses other things, fibrotic tissue, water, connective tissue, things like that. And I said, wait a minute. A lot of our labs have DEXA or BIA or underwater weighing, and it's still a measure if you do pre-post. So we don't want to sort of negate everything completely. It is a poor predictor of strength. However, this elegant study here out of Europe clearly showed that 50% of your measure is what they consider dry muscle. So if we just sort of go back here, 1.8 kilograms, if we say half of that, are you willing to take 700 grams of muscle in a population that is going through sarcopenia where they're losing? So just think about that. And I hate to tell you this, but the biological processes of aging start when you're 40 years of age or older. We're going to talk about the prevalence of sarcopenia, but when you hit that 40th birthday, the tears might start coming down a little bit more because you're losing basically muscle morphology, type 2 muscle fibers are starting to process. Are you willing to go out and buy 700 grams of muscle? I am, because I'm already losing, so now we're actually showing that resistance training and creatine can be a mitigating effect for sarcopenia. And it was well received last year in New Mexico. I'm sure there's people talking about this in Toulouse, France as well. So if 50% of that muscle area is muscle mass, I think this has potential massive implications from an anti-sarcopenic potential or perspective. The question begs, is it weight training or is it creatine? Okay, and Bruno, I think, is speaking a little bit later, pre-recorded, but the group out of Brazil has done some exceptional, elegant studies. I'll talk about them shortly. But this clearly showed that without exercise, a small dose of creatine on a daily basis for over 200 individuals, and as we all know, when you're doing creatine human research, it's very difficult to get adequately sample size populations. Creatine has sort of a minimal effect, if anything. So I think the driving force from a lean body mass or muscle mass perspective is exercise, weight-bearing exercise primarily. Creatine is sort of going to be an adjunct to that, and we'll talk about some of the mechanisms very shortly. And then we sort of get into a little bit more elaborate. So there's always issues with DEXA, BIA, and then of course now what about these three-dimensional or even advanced four-dimensional technologies? So we sort of wanted to look at a pilot study, sort of looking at muscle density, and we had a small group of individuals 50 years in age and above. The average age was about 53, so these were postmenopausal females for at least 12 months and or older adults 50 and above. And then we did 1 year supervised resistance training because as we know, if we're losing, you need to have an intervention that sort of mitigates the effect and then get a rebound effect. The creatine or placebo was a little bit higher than what you've heard of earlier. We were under the mindset, Adam Persky did a really exceptional review article in 2003 showing that the larger you are, you may require more creatine. So is a 2 to 3 gram standard dose good for an offensive lineman or someone who's 200 pounds? We don't think so. It's very similar to the caffeine research. So we've adopted this protocol 0.1 gram per kilogram. So if you're 70 kilograms, those individuals get 7 grams a day. If you're 100 kilograms, they get 10 grams a day. And lo and behold, when you look at the lower limb muscle density, so below the knee, and so when would you ever come into play with this? In Canada when there's ice and you suddenly slip, can those muscles stop you from falling? Okay? At a young age, you fall and get embarrassed. At an older age, if you fall and suffer a fracture or breakage, it's a lot of mobility issues. This is really why it's from a functional perspective. But this is quite interesting. An entire year of supervised training, 3 days a week in our labs, you can see that creatine increased lower leg muscle density by 3-dimensional PQCT by a very, 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 very small amount. The group who just performed resistance training had no creatine actually got a slight decrease. So again, the crappy biological process of aging is detrimental. Even exercise, the most potent non-pharmacological intervention we have, you have to do it. If you're not currently doing exercise, please start immediately because most of the world's population are doing nothing. So look at the catastrophic effects there. So I think exercise is really something that goes hand in hand with creatine. Again, this is published in Medicine and Science in Sports and Exercise. Oh, the other big thing is look at the variability when you're looking at older adults, where they're starting, where they're going. That's a big issue. And a lot of times with aging research, it's really difficult to get significance statistically because the variability is so high and the imaging devices we're using is so limited with standard errors. A meta-analysis we actually sort of looked at before, okay, you take the whole body, but what about segmental? Bicep, tricep, quadricep, calf muscle. What about those who have injury? What about paralysis? What about those individuals in here who have suffered a fracture? They put a plaster cast on. Can you still get some small beneficial effects? This meta-analysis looked at 6 studies. 5 were actually all 6 were from my lab, which is ironic, so don't negate any of that. It was still hopefully good research. 1 is the QCT that we just used, and the other 5 were ultrasound. They looked at 282 participants, and the sample sizes did range. And not a lot of good promise here. Even when you look at muscle ultrasound or PQC, that small incremental increases in millimeters, very, very, very small anabolic muscle growth perspective. So social media takes all this and says creatine's useless, nothing will happen. I was like, wait, whoa, you're missing the narrative. Remember, you're losing on a daily basis. Every time you get out of bed, cardiovascular function goes down, muscle mass can go down as well. 1 day of bed rest reduces muscle proteins by about 6%. So if you exercise and take creatine, you can get a slight reversal. Like, I'm not talking massive amounts, but I think for my grandparents and parents, this is something to consider. Move the body, and maybe creatine is just something very small, but really, really important. So from a healthy aging perspective, I think it is viable from a lean tissue and or muscle growth perspective. For the phenomenal researchers in here, the next study that needs to be done is actually measuring muscle, combining biopsies with MRI and D3 creatine. That's way over my head, but I know there's some exceptional people in this audience or watching. That is the next logical study to do. So what I'm saying is, can we take someone like Arnold and reverse it? I don't think so, okay? But you can even see that Arnold is going through sarcopenia. Now, he still has substantial bone mass and muscle mass, but an accumulation of body fat, and we'll talk about those conditions shortly. But I think at the end of the day, exercise and nutrition, and I think creatine really needs to be a focal point, and that's why we're having this conference for the next 4 days. So at the end of the day, if someone says, should I take creatine to really improve muscle mass? I say no, you're going to get small effects. There's a lot more other applications for that. But again, you're offsetting the negative attributes of sarcopenia and the catastrophic effects of aging. This is the #1 reason you should be considering creatine from a musculoskeletal perspective. The #1 reason you're going to be placed in a long-term care facility is a lack of strength. It's well documented, especially in Canada. And this is where the research is really robust, okay? Now, there's a caveat. When you look at all the recent data up to 2025, normally upper body strength is measured by chest press, which is essentially useless. The only person who uses chest press is individuals in multi-limb sports, such as bilateral, or an offensive lineman. When do you ever go against the wall and press twice? You don't. However, if you were to grab this chair and, maybe Thea, watch out. But there's many things you need where you need to use 2 limbs simultaneously. I'm going to use the prop here in a little bit, but if I break anything, I promise I'll pay for it. Upper body strength, really important. Carrying your groceries, shoveling the driveway in Canada. Creatine resistance training, the most robust, highest probability is improving upper body strength. What I didn't show here is we're working on the paper, which we'll talk about at the end for part of the conference. It's now been shown in a meta-analysis to improve hand grip strength, the global indicator of functionality later on. So when Theo tries to grab his big bag of goodies, if he wasn't strong enough, he's sad, he's going to start crying because he can't take home all the delicious chocolates. But since he's taken creatine for his whole life, he can pick it up, hand grip strength. But I picture your mother trying to open a jar of mayonnaise, something at home, they're like, open this. And I'm like, what if I die? What are you going to do? They're like, well, I won't eat it. No, they need to have some functional capacity with that, and it's important. This is a little area of controversy. So lower body strength below the belly button, it's inconsistent. So there's a lot of robust evidence with upper body strength, but this is a little inconsistent that 3 of the 7 studies and reviews that have looked at creatine and resistance training on lower body strength, only 3 of 7 show significant improvements. Okay? 3 of 7. I think there's some reasons for this that you may not be aware of. The probability was almost there, but again, when we looked at the totality of evidence, what is causing those muscles below the belly button to be more negatively impaired? And I'll use the chair here very shortly. So my mentor, Dr. Phil Chilbeck, who's not here, but he's one of the most exceptional researchers from a clinical health perspective, we argued and questioned, what is going on? So if you were to look at me in this chair, a lot of older adults will sit, and the first thing they do is what? They use their hands, push, minimal lower body effort. If you take an older adult and say, I just want you to lift, they're like, oh, I can't. Off the toilet, out of bed, getting out of chair. We typically use upper body strength. So maybe the big lower limbs are not being activated as much as possible. That was comfortable. I might just sit back down. But anyway, when you look at the data, and this was quite unique, Phil did an exceptional job. He looked at all the studies that segmented muscle from the above the knee to below the knee. And when you exclude all the calf studies, and you look at the big vastus lateralis, again, the study or the muscle groups you do during squat, leg press, football, or getting out of a chair, low or older adults had reduced phosphocreatine content or stores compared to younger individuals. So maybe as we get older, if there is an impairment, we need more to overcompensate or overcome those deficits. So that was one idea. Maybe older adults in the big muscles have greater deficits. They just need more supplementation or higher dosages, which I'm a big proponent of, or longer periods of time. And lower body muscle groups are clinically significant. When you look at a falls and fracture prevention strategy, the lower leg or lower body muscle groups should be emphasized. So never miss leg day, and do legs more often than chest and biceps. I tell that to my students quite often. And the proof is in the pudding. During my PhD, we sort of wanted to substantiate the idea that muscle groups in your body are different. And I just want to highlight the ones in orange. Sadly, this is below the belly button. The knee flexors are your hamstring. Knee extensors are your quadricep, and of course the calf muscle. And 3.14 rads means fast twitch fibers. 1.05 is slow, the ones you're using right now to breathe, the ones that you're using to walk up to your room. Think of fast twitch, sprinting, football, explosive movements. And sadly, if anybody in here is 50 and above, you need to accept you're never going to be as strong as your younger counterparts. Not a single muscle group in older adults achieved 100% of strength of a young group. But this was quite interesting. The upper body achieved almost the same level of strength. The lower limbs were more atrophied and couldn't produce nearly as much strength and power. So please exercise, and please go to those machines that focus on legs. It will be substantially beneficial from a longevity perspective. Chest and biceps is fine Friday, but you should be focusing on the lower body from an anti-aging perspective. Obviously, this graph is showing all muscle groups should be targeted, but it is something to consider. So maybe there's greater atrophy in the lower limbs, you need to do more volume. So actually, we've used this from an exercise prescription. For the upper body, we do 3 sets to fatigue. The lower body, older adults, get this, 6 sets and above. They need to do more volume to overcompensate for those deficits. So we have lower phosphocreatine, maybe. Maybe there's greater detriments in muscle. Then what about the dose? Okay, have we been prescribing too low? I argue that 2 to 3 grams of creatine nowadays is the same as me recommending the RDA for protein. It's way too low. We have a plethora of benefits on higher dosages. So is the dose too low for older adults? Remember, that 2 to 5 gram dose is purely for skeletal muscle. We have bone, and then we heard earlier on the brain. So maybe we need to revisit the dosing strategies. And we recently did this from a dosing perspective, a meta-analysis a few years ago, when you looked at all the aging adult studies at 5 grams or less, there was no significant increase in lower body strength. Let me repeat that. When you look at all the studies at 5 grams or less, no improvement in lower body strength in older adults. So if you stop there, you're like, is 5 grams enough? Likely not. When you look at the studies 5 grams or more, greater than 5, there was a significant increase in strength. Okay? So maybe those lower limbs, phosphocreatine distribution or muscle, but this was quite interesting. When you look at all the data, and then you go to the studies that did not use a creatine loading phase, that eliminated the benefits in strength. So we've used this now that when you're working with older adults, that low initial daily dose may not be enough to sort of super compensate. You may want to think of the loading phase plus a higher dose, especially for lower limbs. Okay? So the loading phase primarily for athletes, But this is something to at least consider. For those graduate students in here, if you're thinking of your thesis, don't get too defeated if you don't find any results. It might come down to the strategy of the dosing you do. So there's definitely something going on with the biological process of aging. What about functional ability? As I just mentioned, most of us will use upper body strength to get up off the toilet, out of bed, out of a chair, but if there's no limbs, you have to use other functionalities there. There's been now 3 meta-analyses that have looked at functionality, and this is by the World Health Organization's criteria for diagnosing sarcopenia. Low probability, but it was right at a statistical significance. Dr. Mark Tarnopolsky's colleague, Stu Phillips, has done one a few years ago, and the one just recently came out, concluding the same thing. Creatine and exercise will improve some functionality measures, such as sit to stand. I think this is crucial from a knowledge translation perspective. Those individuals can get out of chairs, off the toilet, out of bed, out of a car a little bit easier than normal. So there is some really good promise here with functionality, but I think strength and functionality is very, very important. And those are the 3 diagnosing criteria for sarcopenia: low muscle strength, quantity, and or functionality. I'll spend the next 17 and a half hours describing how we think it works. This was from Phil's meta-analysis and review paper. And this is interesting because I just want to highlight on a few things that never gets a lot of press and things that we may not know. So it definitely increases anabolic processes, satellite cells, insulin-like growth factor, transcription factors. But ironically, if I was to poll the audience, it's never ever been shown to induce myofibular hypertrophy. Tim Zingfus is in the back. He did an exceptional section in that myths and misconception paper. We've looked at all the data. I'm on a paper right now with Mike Roberts, and we still do not see any increase in muscle protein synthesis. Mark's group, actually, with Johnny Parisi, looked at whole body muscle protein synthesis and catabolism by using leucine, and they weren't able to show it. And it kind of makes sense. Creatine, if you think arginine, glycine, methionine, where are the other essential amino acids? It has not been shown directly to increase muscle protein synthesis. We think it induces these positives in other ways, okay? The big area I want to sort of focus on is the anti-catabolic effects of creatine. This is sort of the emergence. And Sergey talked about the brain. We think one of the biggest things now is maybe we're reducing muscle protein breakdown, which Mark's group has shown. Maybe it's reducing inflammation. There's been elegant studies now in long-duration marathon trainers and or long-distance Ironman showing that cytokines are reduced with creatine. Theo's actually shown many times how the creatine kinase reaction is expressed. So there's a lot of mechanisms. We still have about 30 to 50 more years, so you can't retire, Theo. You've got to keep doing this stuff to see really why it works. We think we have an idea, but really we don't. And this is how we summarize it. From the mechanisms, get this. We think all the check marks have been shown in younger adults, nothing in protein synthesis, and look what's been shown in older adults, nothing, right? So again, this is an area for graduate student work, or if you're going on, because the governments like to give out money for aging, they don't like to give it out for young, healthy people. This is an area where we may need a pivot from a greater perspective. So again, we have many areas to go. So in summary, this is the totality of evidence-based research. Creatine and resistance training will increase lean body mass. That'll also improve some incidences of lower limb muscle density, which is a precursor for falls and fracture. And then I put a star by upper and lower body strength. I think those are the big areas that have been shown. Now we switch to bone, and someone in the audience was must have been bored at the time, because we thought we knew everything. We're like, we know everything about creatine, bigger, stronger, faster, and that's why the roller coaster of research. Then Dr. Wallyman came on and looked at his exceptional paper on bone physiology. And if you remember how the bone remodeling process works, you get osteoclast being activated. That'll put more calcium in the blood. It basically sends signals to calcitonin to stimulate osteoblasts. And this has massive implications for bone-related diseases. And so we sort of pivoted here. And I'm glad Mark's here. He sort of laid the foundation by looking at Duchenne muscular dystrophy and Becker's. They also did an animal study in rodents, and they were showing improvements in bone mineral density with creatine. So the rodents were running around. The individuals were independent of wheelchair. They were getting beneficial effects. and Dr. Phil Chillibeck also looked at bone mineral content. So taking Theo's sort of cellular elegance, and there was another study looking at in vitro, could creatine be added to a standard treatment care for older adults and have any bone beneficial effects? Most people say, who cares? I'm like, mostly every biological female on this planet is going to care because they have the highest prevalence of osteoporosis, osteopenia, and frailty. So 25% for females and about 20% for males. So essentially, everybody on the planet should be very interested in not only improving muscle, but also bone as well. Going back to that seminal study we did for 1 year in postmenopausal females, I don't have a private jet. I was joking with my friends earlier. I did not cure osteoporosis, okay? But this was quite interesting. So we piggybacked after Mark's animal model, and we looked at postmenopausal females, not on hormone replacement, 3 days a week of supervised weight training, trying to cause the mechanical stimuli to the bone as much as possible. See, if I broke it, I'd buy it. Oh, I did break the remote, though. Sorry. Oh, pay for that one, no problem. Again, we use DEXA. There's about a 3 to 5% error, standard error of measurement with DEXA. So the issue by using DEXA to measure bone mineral density growth, you're losing about 1% of your bone mineral per year, and if there's that much error, you're going to need long-term studies, like long-term studies to overcompensate for this. But this was quite interesting. No group mean was above baseline. We didn't cure osteoporosis. Look at the variability in older adults. But the females who took a very high dose of creatine, it was about 8 to 9 grams per day, every day during an entire year, they experienced a negative 1% reduction in bone mineral density of the hip. The females who just did weight training almost approached clinically significance in a bad way. They had a 4% reduction in bone mineral density. So what it says is aging is bad, exercise is good, because if you had a group that did no exercise, it could be catastrophic. You need the mechanical stimuli from exercise to cause a driving effect, and creatine is working some way to preserve the skeleton. Do you know not a single product that's out there ever promotes bone health? It's always muscle and cognition. It boggles my mind why that is. Because the best randomized control trials with the adequate sample size are in the bone area. A 5% reduction, this is based on Johns Hopkins data, is associated with a 25% reduction or increase in fracture. So if your grandmother was to fall and it hits the hip, they're at a higher risk of hip replacement surgery and chronic morbidity throughout. If you fall, it's just embarrassing. Okay, so keep in mind the area that we focused on. Now we go back to sort of those meta-analysis. So that was one single study, but the data on bone is not very appealing or uplifting. When you look at all the current data, this includes studies that did not incorporate exercise. There's no improvement in bone mineral density. The probability is not even close. When you look at the femoral neck, even including our studies, probability 1.00. Bone takes a long time to turn over. Okay, is this going to be an osteoporotic intervention? Not even close. Okay, it may have some application for clinical populations. Lumbar spine, biggest area for osteoporosis, we're not seeing any effects there as well. A lot of these studies are substantially underpowered. For those who do bone research, you need to really accept it's going to take years to do really adequate bone mineral density research unless you look at biological markers. So, we asked the Canadian government, we got a big grant. It was about 500,000 Canadian or about €9 or $12 US. I'm not joking, this took a decade to do. I had hair when we started, and now look what happened. We had randomized 200 postmenopausal females because the arguments were, well, you know that the body's breaking down. Maybe you need to do longer duration, or focus on this. Look at the dose. Let's do the highest dose, okay? So in a stagger strategy, to get 200 postmenopausal females to exercise for 2 years, and then we followed them up for an additional year, that means that person was volunteering for 3 years times 200 and some individuals. When you measure bone strength up to 24 months, not a lot's happening. Super high dose creatine, 11 grams of Creapure, which we use per day, maintained the integrity of the skeleton. There was a slight decrease in those on placebo. Okay? But the magnitude of response is very large. When you look at bone buckling ratio, I can't break this, I don't think. But if you have your pen and you try to snap it in half, that's your bone. You don't want that. So bone buckling ratio is the strength of the bone. Preserved with creatine, and it actually got worse with placebo. That means their bones had a greater chance of breaking. But 2 years of exercise and a high-dose creatine, again, we're not seeing any big clinical significant effects. Now, moving on to three-dimensional, the PQCT, going back to the muscle density study, 53 participants. Again, we're going to go back to that study where we looked at 0.1 grams per day. This is a bit interesting, so it may come down to the imaging you're using. So now when you look at the bone below the knee, the tibialis, we saw a lot greater effects. So the strain of exercise, hitting muscle density going up, maybe that was causing some anabolic effects to the bone, because there was some slight reductions on those on placebo. So again, I'm trying to pace this from a evidence-based perspective. There's not a lot of big effects, but I think as we get older, I think this is something you want to consider. Exercise, and I think creatine is like the sprinkles on top of that cake. It might make you exercise a bit more if it's causing some advantageous effects. I should point out these were in all healthy older adults. They were not diagnosed with disease, and I'm going to talk shortly about that. Bone strength and area are significant predictors of hip fracture, and hip fracture is a main cause of functional impairment. In Canada, super small country, we spend $700 million a year just on hip replacement surgery. Times that for the United States or all over here in Europe is catastrophic, right? From a healthcare perspective, that's just one area. How it likely works, we don't know. We've used SEAL's mechanisms from a diagnostic perspective and Mark's papers, obviously. But Phil wrote this for a textbook article, and he really did a good job suggesting that maybe the osteoblasts get energized. If you remember Super Mario in the original Nintendo, if he got the mushroom, he became energized. We think maybe those osteoblast cells will use creatine for fuel. And then if you go into some cellular data, they actually release or upregulate a cytokine. It's like a decoy. It's called osteoprotogerin. It sort of stimulates or decreases osteoclasts from being activated. So as we get older, if osteoclasts are attenuated and maybe osteoblasts are maintained, you might be able to preserve the skeleton more often. So I flip my way I answer this on podcasts and media, that creatine may have some anti-catabolic effects to the bone. It may preserve what you have. It's very similar if you're taking a bisphosphonate. It might have the same analogy with that, but these are some of the potential mechanisms. Not a single study has ever done bone biopsies to look at these cells, which is sad and obviously needs to be done. Luc van Loon is in the Netherlands, and he's thinking of doing one of those. We tried to look at some mechanisms. We gave older adults 50 and above 0.1 grams per kilogram. And we measured a surrogate marker of bone catabolism, NTL peptides. It was reduced by 30%. But Mark's study in 2003, they showed no increase in osteocalcin or other predictors of bone growth. And the Brazilian group has not seen any anabolic effects or anti-catabolic effects from a cellular perspective with creatine. So some studies show there's something there, but I think this is a huge area of potential later on with sophisticated imaging and things like that. What maybe is happening is if you're getting any bone effects, if you have more muscle or lean mass, maybe it's pulling on the bone. So every time you're doing a repetition, it's stimulating the bone to get stronger. So again, another reason that exercise is beneficial. And maybe that's why the lower limbs of aerobic individuals usually have high bone density. It's the mechanical strain to that. Tour de France, upper body, probably going to get sarcopenia and osteoporosis. Lower body never usually happens. So the stimuli to the body. So in summary, creatine, again, the lowest dose ever been shown to be effective is 8 grams. From a muscle, it's a lot lower. It can have some very small beneficial effects on bone. It can decrease urinary indicators of bone breakdown, but please note it does not increase bone mineral density. In no way are we saying it's a cure for osteopenia or osteoporosis, but hopefully the light went off in your head. You're like, wait a minute, you've never done this in people diagnosed with osteoporosis. You've never done this in frail adults. Maybe they might be more responsive. So for the students in here looking for a thesis, that's a really good population to target. We just put this paper out last week. Me and some colleagues look at the potential for osteosarcopenia. It's considered the geriatric giant. You do not want this. That means you have diagnosed sarcopenia and osteoporosis at the same time. We think that creatine and resistance training can have some favorable effects, at least mitigating these symptoms. And this is an open access paper if you want to look at that as well. We'll switch quickly to fat. I think I have some time. We've done 2 meta-analyses because a lot of people are very hesitant, primarily females, to take creatine, either water retention, that's just an error in their dosing. A lot of people say, oh, does it increase body fat? Ironically, from 18 and above, we actually don't see any increase in body fat. If anything, we see a very small decrease. So for those that are out there saying, I know people who are hesitant to take creatine, we don't see any increase. The decrease is minimal, but just think from an obesity or metabolic syndrome perspective worldwide, this metabolite is certainly not causing any detrimental effects. And there's some good animal research to suggest that the increase in metabolism by thermogenesis. Also, a very small decrease in decreasing absolute body fat. So I think for the clinical researchers in here, the GLP plus creatine to offset the lean tissue mass loss, someone's going to do that study. It's going to be very expensive, but it's definitely coming into play. Obviously, creatine can be an adjunct to that. So from a rebody composition perspective, it improves lean mass, maybe decrease body fat, maybe have a sparing of bone mineral. Your body might get a bit stronger from an anti-aging or healthy aging perspective. So we put this study out a few years ago suggesting that maybe creatine has applications for sarcopenia, osteoporosis, and if it does have anything for obesity, some of you have probably come across a syndrome, sarcopenic obesity, combining osteoporosis, so it's the triad of aging, which we definitely don't want. So obviously we're talking about the health aspects. This is the areas that we're going to be focusing on for the next while. So where does it come? Osteosarcopenic obesity, sarcopenia, all the way up to osteoporosis seems to have the clinical applications. And I'm not going to steal most people here's thunder. Perfect, I got time. I can fall over and no problem. Just the brain, okay, because I flew 9 hours, 7-hour time change. People often say, wow, I've heard that creatine can be really good for the brain. I tell my students jet lag, cognition, sleep deprivation, but what about the older brain? It's an organ. It is atrophying, okay? We're more susceptible to Alzheimer's, dementia, things like that. So as we all know, I don't want to take a lot of the steam away from our esteemed colleagues that will be presenting throughout the conference, but it's only about 2 kilograms. Mine's only 1 kilogram. Yours is a lot bigger, but it uses about 20% of your energy. So if you've been jet lagged, metabolic syndrome, you have fatigue, sleep deprivation, jet lag, students staying up all night, you're having some fogginess right now. And you're like, where am I? I don't even know where I'm at. Coffee's not helping. This is where we think creatine can really come to the rescue based on evidence-based perspectives. The idea is, can creatine get into our brain? So obviously Theo and Sergey talked about this briefly, but this study done by Bruno's group is elegant, is one of the best I've ever seen. They've looked at MRS, which is the MRI for the brain, and they looked at, could a super high dose of creatine get into the brain? Ali's in the audience. His study there has been cited now almost a few thousand times. But 7 days at 0.3 grams, so about 25 grams, way more than your traditional 2 to 5, there's no effect. We've already heard the brain has the blood-brain barrier, endogenous synthesis. I don't want what's coming from the peripheral tissues. But yes, you do. When the brain is stressed, it's begging for help. That endogenous synthesis, I don't think is enough, okay? So if you have a chance to read this study, please do so. It clearly shows there's differences in muscle. Muscle acts as a vacuum to take up creatine. The brain, trickling amounts, is not going to do it. Serge's paper looked at 4 grams. It took 3 months to look at. Most individuals may not need that much over time. The delta change from muscle to brain was very small. One of the big reasons, if you go back to basic physiology, is that unfortunately we have a lot of transporters in bone and muscle. The transporters are there at the brain, but our dumb astrocytes, which we think should be a lot smarter, they say, no, I don't need you. I don't have any transporters. The oligodendrocytes, which are making basically the central nervous system and myelin, they do have the transport kinetics, but the epithelial cells at your capillaries only have that little doorway. So again, there's a blunted response coming into the body, therefore you may need more or have a lot less, or sorry, longer duration of time. The only area of promise as it currently stands for older adults is memory. There's only been 2 studies to look at this, and it's debatable. If the brain is not stressed, it's highly unlikely you're going to get any benefit. But right now, I'm taking 20 grams a day. I started 4 days ago. I'm probably the most saturated person on the planet. I've been taking creatine daily for 2 decades, and I've even increased it up to 20 to hope it's going to allow me to stand up here, present data, being totally jet lagged with no sleep, right? So these are the areas where you use it. I think a student staying up all night cramming for a midterm could have some application. Not to take a lot of the cloud away, but Serge will probably talk about how creatine decreases an indicator of neurological damage, and BDNF has been shown to go up in mice. So I think this is an area that's going to be huge for the next 20 or 30 years. How it works, I'm not going to get into a lot of detail. I have about a minute left. But I think from the brain, it's reducing oxidative stress. Good researchers out of Belgium have shown in the rodent model it decreases inflammation, oxidative stress. So if anybody has jet lag now, you have oxidative stress going on. Those poor mitochondria can't keep up. Other areas of hope, there's a study now going on with Alzheimer's. We're starting one with clinical dementia shortly. But there's not a lot of other big research on Parkinson's, Huntington's, multiple sclerosis, probably because those studies need such large sample sizes to offset biological aging. But this is the area I think it should be going. So in summary, there's no evidence that creatine will accumulate in the brain significantly in older adults yet. Just those studies need to be done. It shows some preliminary promise, but geez, we have no clue on the optimal dosage or the area of the brain, white or gray matter. So I love this Samaric study or review. Maybe creatine is an adjunct to sort of top up the brain. So when you go through these stressors, it only comes back to baseline data, and that's what I try to implement. So I'm always trying to say you should top up the tank, because you never know when you're going to have a bad night's sleep or get asked to come to Europe. You know what I mean? You just never know. There's a study we're going to be working on as part of this conference. It's about 47 pages now. We're going to have to tone it down a little tiny bit. And I got time over, right on time. There's my email and